Is there a reason why it's echoing?
I think it's because you're on two devices.
Say that again.
I think it's because you're on two devices.
Oh, it wasn't echoing before. What did I do differently? Okay.
If you mute, maybe the computer. Okay, I think it's fine.
Hey everybody, welcome. Andrea is gonna get us started.
Go back 2 slides.
Andrea, we can't hear you. Andrea, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sam, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. So, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So, hello everybody. Welcome to Getting to the Roots of Ableism. About ableism. So we have a lot of wonderful disabled climate activists and disability activists here to speak on the intersection between this movement and the disability community. So I'm Samantha Hurley, she, her, hers pronouns. I'm from the 0 Hour Music team and I'm really excited. So I'll let everyone else introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle Zui. And I'm from the music team of 0 Hour, and I use she and her pronouns.
Hi, I'm Ava Stahl. I'm on partnerships, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm also on the music team, 0 Hour, and I use she, her pronouns. And we have some amazing guest presenters on as well.
Hi, I'm Izzy. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from Disability Awareness Around the Climate Crisis.
Hey y'all, my name is Maddie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a queer and disabled activist that runs the page Your Fave Disabled Gal.
So what is disability? Society. Okay. Society views disability as something that is wrong and needs to be cured or fixed. Oftentimes, disabled people are seen as burdens, as puzzles, and as subhuman.
And so this is a lot of this plays into the medical model of disability, which sees the disabled person as the problem and focuses on the impairment of others and person's needs. And it emphasizes dependence and stereotypes of disability that call forth pity, fear, and patronizing attitudes. And so what we're trying to do is shift to a more social model of disability. Yeah, I'm not sure why all this is fast. All of my stuff is muted. Is your Google Hangouts muted? Yeah. So the social model of disability. Is this better for you guys? Maybe. Okay. The social model of disability sees society as the problem, and the cure is in changing society. It sees the impairment as natural and disability as constructed, and recognizes that impairments may limit function, but that doesn't make anyone less valuable. So I guess some key terms to know about, or for this presentation, is impairment versus disablement. So impairment is the loss or limitation of physical, mental, or sensory function on a long-term or permanent basis. And disablement is the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in normal life of the community on an equal level with others due to physical and social barriers. So one is impaired by their functionality, but they are disabled by their environment and the loss of opportunities that they see from the community and the social and physical barriers that are in place.
So for defining ableism, the definition, ableism is a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities, and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or another, which we know not to be true. And in activist spaces specifically, it is an activist's responsibility when fighting for issues that traverse multiple marginalized groups to understand the struggles of the groups of which their work impacts. And a key phrase here is nothing about us without us. When we're talking about disability advocacy, the advocates should be disabled people and people with disabilities, not people speaking on behalf of us or over us.
So ecoableism is a form of ableism or discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. So the eco comes from the environmental activists who, through attempting to save the environment, don't do so that and takes account for those with less privilege within them, which is, in this case, people with disabilities. So sustainability is great, but certain types of sustainability are not accessible to everyone. We all have a role to play in sustaining our planet, but it's not the same role. Because one of the biggest discriminations people with disabilities can face is simply not being included or thought of in the first place. And this ties in heavily with ecoableism, where in climate movements, people with disabilities are not thought of, and then that can be ableist and eco-ableist.
So now expanding on this, some ways that you'll see eco-ableism expand into the movement spaces with people assuming that there is one way to be sustainable and there's one way to contribute to a sustainable earth. So something to recognize with this is that everyone comes from a different background, and one of the biggest discriminations people with disabilities can face is simply not being included or thought of in the first place, or being shamed for not being able to participate in the same way. We all have a role to play in sustaining our planet, but not a same role. So moving into some examples of eco-ableism, starting with some general ideologies. An issue that the 0 Hour in particular, and as well as the climate movement, focuses on is how capitalism affects climate change and environmentalism. So this also intersects with the disability community, because capitalism also instills the idea that success is based on monetary value rather than something such as intrinsic merit, or like value just to society or who you are as a person. A lot of a person's value or idea of success is based on how they walk themselves down a particular path in life. And this translates into this movement space as well, the movement space of climate activism, because people are expected to be sustainable in a linear idea of ways, and that often is going to exclude disabled people and can very frequently come off as ableist. So it's just important to look at capitalism and look at like how this bleeds into our movement spaces, even though sometimes we may speak out against it. And it's just very important. Big solution to this ideology is not looking at one way is right. Not looking at one solution is right. There's multiple different solutions to problems, and not everybody has the privilege to make certain choices. So making sure we don't deem one way is right and way is wrong will ensure that we don't exclude valuable people from a movement space. So now I'm going to pass it on to Gabrielle, and yeah.
So one really prevalent example of this eco-ableism, especially over the past few years, is the plastic straw ban. So as many of you may know, plastic isn't the best for the environment. That being said, plastic is necessary for certain uses in many people's lives. Disabled and chronically ill people sometimes need plastic straws for access, safety, and medical purposes. And disabled people were very much left out of the conversation around the plastic straw ban. And, you know, the reasons why we needed it, or the reasons why we needed adjustments to it. And creating bans for things really causes people in some situations to need to prove their disability in order to just get access to this basic human need, this accommodation that they've been using their whole life without a problem. Could you go to the next slide, please? So on this chart, it shows a chart of different alternatives for plastic straws that there were always ads for and everything, which is great for people who can use them. They should use them. But for people to whom this isn't accessible, it's just not appropriate to demand that they use these things. So whether it's an allergy risk, a choking hazard, an injury risk, not being safe for hot liquids, not, you know, standing for a long amount of time without disintegrating, if it's hard to sanitize, or especially if it's high cost, especially considering that people with disabilities and disabled people are proportionally affected by poverty. These things just don't make alternatives accessible. And the burden really should not be on the individual consumers who are disabled or not, or whatever, to try to make their own little lives eco-friendly when it's really a much bigger scale we should be focusing on. And the coronavirus actually has really highlighted these sorts of examples of ableism, because accommodations around plastic that the general public wasn't willing to make for people with disabilities, suddenly it's okay for us to make those accommodations because everyone needs them, able-bodied and not. So there's medical plastic that's being used and that people have been told, oh, you don't need to use so much plastic. But I guess an example specific to me, I have celiac disease. And that means that cross-contamination with gluten is a really big problem for me. I could be hospitalized if I ate a cookie or something like that. But with coronavirus, we see, sorry, one second. I'm so sorry.
As she
Hi,
was saying,
I'm so sorry for the interruption there. But with coronavirus, we've seen the use of plastic packaging when we get food deliveries, and the use of plastic in various masks and gloves and all these things that are single use. And that's excusable because it's for coronavirus, it's just for the greater good. But that kind of says, you know, with people with disabilities, that our needs this whole time weren't for the greater good, we were just the other group. And also with the coronavirus pandemic, the language around only the disabled and chronically ill is really problematic, because the media is isolating a minority in order to ease the public and reduce the severity of the virus, when in reality the virus is a threat to everyone. And high-risk people are not an afterthought. If you walk into a room and said, oh, it's okay, we can continue with our lives, you know, if I get coronavirus, I won't die, it's just the elderly and the disabled. Anyone in that room who is elderly or disabled or chronically ill or whatever it is going to feel incredibly dehumanized, because you kind of just said their lives matter less than the economy. So yeah, on to this.
So another really big thing that's not necessarily about the climate movement, but rather what the climate movement is fighting, and that is the climate crisis. And one of the biggest things about the climate crisis that affects people with disabilities is disasters, which are increased in amount and severity by the climate crisis. And going back to what Gabrielle said, where people are just not thinking about this, is that people just don't really think about these issues, and people are dying a lot every day because of these disasters, and many of those people are people with disabilities, just because it's not thought about. So one of the biggest things is in these disasters is the evacuation and transportation, which can be inaccessible for people with disabilities, and people with disabilities are left behind or unable to make it on the transportation. So people with disabilities, particularly those with severe physical disabilities, usually rely on a support and caregiving network to ensure that they can be safe, whether this be family, friends, or paid workers. And during these disasters, people can get separated, and there's not plans and protection set in place, and then they can die. And for example, this exact thing happened with a woman during Hurricane Katrina. She drowned in her own bed because she wasn't able to evacuate.
Yeah, and then another important issue is medication. So as natural disasters worsen, access to life-saving medication can be interrupted. It's absolutely essential that people have access to their medication, and without it, they could die or have their quality of life significantly decreased.
Yeah, it's just they're with medication and evacuation transportation, they are all closely tied together to escaping a disaster, and that is just can be inherently inaccessible um, to people with disabilities. And something as simple as having a door wide enough to have a wheelchair fit through can literally be the difference between life and death. And that's just why it's so important that these things are set up for people with disabilities so people are not dying.
And then building onto that, when natural disasters come, access to hospitals can be interrupted. No matter what's happening in the world, people are going to need to have access to the hospital, whether that's for life-saving things or just physical therapy or to increase their quality of life. In a disaster, they may be deprived of that. And if they're forced to migrate, they may not have access to health insurance. We need to have healthcare for all in order to solve this inequality.
And another thing is that not necessarily a disaster, but something that is certainly caused by the climate crisis is extreme heat and weather irregularities, and that can make people with disabilities worse. And especially because disabled people experience disproportionate poverty levels and live in lower quality housing on average compared to those without disabilities, so they may not have access to air conditioning. This is especially relevant in today when you read articles about extreme heat that's occurring and people don't have access to air conditioning, and they can't gather in places where there is air conditioning, like a grocery store, because of the coronavirus, and therefore it's just danger on both sides for those with disabilities and those without, but especially those with disabilities. And another example of this on the opposite end of the spectrum is I live in Minnesota. So we had this huge snowstorm and I could barely get to the hospital. I had an appointment at the hospital. I could barely get there because of the amount of snow. And like my neighbor down the street had to get to the hospital for his liver dialysis, and his car couldn't get out of the snow. So like a bunch of people had to come together and shovel him out. And there's many solutions where communities can help people, but it should also just be something that the government is thinking about in the first place.
And then additionally, there's the issue of forced institutionalization. So sometimes the government, quote unquote, doesn't know what to do with disabled people, so they're forced to be institutionalized against their will, and often against their own best interests. This is a gross violation of human rights, and it eliminates their own autonomy.
Yeah, it's really bad. And then another thing is power shutoffs. So storms and other weather events can cause power shutoffs, and many people with disabilities and health issues um, or are reliant on electricity, whether to breathe or something else, and can die without it. This also ties in with the coronavirus, just because many people are reliant on the ventilators and able to breathe, and those need electricity. So it's a very current and continuing issue.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Okay. So when we're talking about, activism, we also have to recognize how capitalism actually infiltrates activist spaces. So capitalism is a system of oppression that pushes the narrative that a person's value is actually based on their productivity. And this is harmful to many, many people who don't have access to work or can't work due to their different ability levels. This leads to a lot of shaming and guilting of not just the disability community, but anyone who can't function under this system. And let's make it known that no one, nobody can effectively function under capitalism because the expectations are too great. And within activism, climate orgs are not exempt from capitalism. And due to the gravity of the climate crisis, there really is a lot of constant pressure in climate orgs and climate justice workers to be 100% productive and to be 100% on it all the time. But this is really harmful to all who are involved, because there is no one who can compete or withstand this level of expectation of production under capitalism. There's instances of in-person activism that's also really inaccessible for folks with disabilities in climate justice. So, for example, the folks that have mobility issues, they will face a lot of physical barriers when you think about stereotypical forms of organizing, whether that's marches or protests. Like, a lot of those spaces are not accessible for folks with physical disabilities. For the deaf and hard of hearing communities, if there's not equitable language interpretation or provided captioning, those kinds of things, like, they're erased from those spaces. Additionally, like, folks with who might experience overstimulation as a part of their disability, common activist events such as marches or like group gatherings can also be really overwhelming and unsafe for them. And the disability community actually organizes and mobilizes a lot online via social media, which is incredible. We've been able to really grow and move together with the age of social media, now that we're able to connect even if we can't connect in person. So these mass movements have actually grown just over like Twitter, Instagram. But if climate orgs or other organizations want to have disabled voices in their space as well, they need to take note and be mindful of the different ways to be accessible online, whether that's, providing captioning on photos or videos, or providing transcripts for different speeches. Things like this are really important if we want to build movements that include all people. Finally, there's a concept called universal design, and this is when we design movements, or you hear it a lot in schools. We design some kind of system with everybody in mind, all marginalized groups in mind. And when we include disabled folks and their voices and their thoughts and their opinions on how to run a climate change movement, we're able to actually build an accessible movement from the start that will amplify their voices and continue their stories. You can go to the next slide.
So now moving into inaccessibility and legislation. So half the battle is being able to mobilize people to fight for what they believe, but the other half is ensuring that people's rights are protected by the law, because at the end of the day, what is written is what goes. So a lot of times you'll see, as laws are made in their preliminary stages, they don't include a wide breadth of people. So this is why you'll see a lot of activists and a lot of civil rights movements, engaging, and because there's not that initial representation and that initial consultation of these marginalized groups. So looking at some examples, so policy is not created, as I've just said, policy is often not created with the thought of disabilities in mind, with the thought of being accessible, and the thought of including those with differences, as well as just the overall, this kind of stems back to the overall lack of access to voting for people with disabilities, and access and lack of representation of disabled lawmakers in our bodies of legislature and government and such. So some examples of the way that this intersects with the climate movement would be through the way that we know that a large contributor to living sustainably, living green, a large idea behind the climate movement is utilizing public transportation. And so this is something that you'll see a lot of climate orgs advocating for, is the use of public transportation. However, for a lot of people with disabilities or people who identify as disabled, the use of public transportation isn't a choice. It's not a privilege. It's a way of getting around. And so the reason I say this is because it's important, as we are fighting to expand this tool, and trying to implement it and build new means of transportation. It's important that we ensure that it is accessible to disabled people, because oftentimes that is their way of getting around, or when they just want to use it like everyone else, or try and be sustainable and reduce the carbon footprint. For example, if you're in a wheelchair and you're trying to go through the subway systems in somewhere, say New York, you shouldn't have to go. There should always be a working elevator. It shouldn't be a matter of if it's broken or not, and then you just simply don't have access to that. Those stations. So then another example of how legislation and more administrative things begin to become inaccessible to disabled people is through the building of sustainable communities / urban planning. So a lot of times when you'll see these things made, again, it's just a factor of things not being made with disabled people in mind, and sometimes inadvertently, the movement spaces will exclude disabled people when creating things, or they'll create a model community that they'll say, like, this is the model of sustainability, but then somehow it excludes disabled people. And so it's just important, whenever trying to organize anything, to include disabled people on your panel, on your team, and make sure that their voices are being heard, because they are a large portion of our population. As we mentioned earlier, evacuation routes and transportation, as Izzy covered, for disasters are often not created with people for people with disabilities in mind, and that goes back to a lot of what she and Gabrielle were saying with the issues you face during a natural disaster, and as well as why it's so important to keep disabled people in mind when making these plans, is because according to the United Nations, there is expected to be at least 200 million climate refugees. Of those 200 million, 18 million will be people with disabilities. That number is expected to increase due to disasters displacing people. Climate-related displacement is a big issue, and the climate movement, of course, knows this, and that's a large reason why we do the work that we do. But it's also important to recognize that a large population of those people are also facing disablement due to these natural disasters and such. So that leads again into why it's so important to create policy with disabled people in mind, to look at the issues that disabled people face in these disasters and say, let's get on top of this. Even if it doesn't affect me personally, it affects millions of people. And if Izzy would like to talk about the policy guide from the World Institute of Disability, I'll let her do that.
Yeah, so the World Institute on Disability is a organization that comes out of the University of Berkeley, and they are an amazing organization. I 100% recommend that you check them out. They have information from about things not related to the climate crisis to the climate crisis, a bunch of information, which includes this policy guide, and it's called Disability and Disaster Readiness Initiative. And so it is basically just a guide where you can follow that when you're like doing your activism, when you're talking to legislators, that you can keep this in mind, have this information, and create policy or fight for policy that follows the guide. It's just such an amazing, helpful resource that I recommend you look at.
So on what to do if you're an eco-ableist. In moving forward towards accessibility and inclusion, it's really, really important that you stop ableist behaviors that you might have recognized that we kind of covered in this presentation, or just others that you might recognize kind of by proxy that are ableist, and start listening to the disabled community and listen to the voices, whether it's in your movement space or outside of the movement space, and recognizing that even if you disagree with what's being said, you're not the authority in that space, and that when it comes to disabled experiences, disabled people are the ones that should be speaking to that and that you should be listening to. And then amplify the voices of disabled people. So something as simple as taking this presentation and sharing it with others and sharing what you learned, amplifying the voices of those on this webinar that you've heard from, and then further engaging with the community, whether that's engaging in our movement spaces so that way you can learn how to bring that back to your movement space and make it accessible, or just engaging in general with more disabled people in your life or on the internet, or just in general, so you can do like just be more a part of the community and help the community to be more part of your communities and make all communities more accessible and inclusive. And then on the next slide, you can follow us on Instagram at This Is 0 Hour, and then our host of panels, our panel of hosts and presenters. All the information is here as well, so you can follow us, and then tune into our podcast next week to learn more. But we're gonna, oh, go ahead, Izzy.
Yeah, I was just gonna say follow DAA Climate Crisis, which is an Instagram dedicated to this issue, and I am typing it in the chat right now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. And then you can just always DM to get involved. We have a lesson plan you can teach and so on.
Yeah. And we're going to move into a question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please toss them into the Q&A box so we can answer them.
Okay.
Okay. Izzy, do you want to take it? If not, I'll piggyback on you.
Yeah, I was just gonna in terms of institutionalization. So basically, we're gonna we'll just use an example to explain this. So for example, you might have someone who has autism and they are migrating because of a disaster, and they may get separated from their family, and then they may not like that person. The government sees them and doesn't know what to do with them. Like they don't know how to get them the proper treatment, which is ridiculous in itself. And so they may put them in like a mental health institute or in a sane asylum kind of thing. So they would be institutionalized, put in an institution against their will, and against their will, and they would not need it, and the government just wouldn't know like how to take care of this. They wouldn't know, like I'm saying this in quotations because the government can absolutely know how to like help this person and set up systems, and this could also tie heavily into racism and sexism when it comes to this, because people of color and indigenous and Black people are more likely to be institutionalized against their will than those who are white.
Yeah, that's basically what institutionalization is, and it's not great. And then we have another question from Eleanor that says, is there a way to modify band movements to be more inclusive? I think the best way to answer that is by saying no. And the reason why I say that is because I remember reading some anecdotes online about different situations people have gone through that kind of because of bans on plastic, and I know Gabrielle can probably speak more to this, so I'll definitely pass this off. but bans on plastic, they were unable to access resources they needed. So just for example, I remember reading about this one person who they were unable to, there was a ban on plastic in their area. And so they had to request like a plastic straw at their local restaurant. But then the restaurant place didn't like believe that they were disabled and needed a straw. And they were like, well, just drink from the cup. And because of how pervasive ableism is, just in everyday life, it's often misunderstood what disability is and what disablement is. And so for somebody to be asked to prove that they need this resource in order to be able to use that just kind of shows that like people don't have an adequate grasp on that. But then just to kind of bring that back to the banning movement, when you're taking that resource out of the community that's necessary, there's no way to rectify that with inclusivity because it's not included, it's not accessible. Like the resource needs to be there. And so that's where the problem, where we look, especially in 0 hour, we say like the people aren't the problem. Like we focus more on institutional change because we can't look at those that are being affected by these situations and say, oh, well, you're the problem, change. And so to ban people from being able to use that, why do that when you can like regulate what is going on corporately? Like we still need to access certain resources. We still need to access plastic straws or materials wrapped in plastic, as Gabrielle was mentioning. And so, no, there's not a way to modify a ban movement to make it more inclusive because it's taking a resource out of the community that needs it. But go ahead, Gabrielle.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, I personally, I don't have mobility issues and don't need to use a straw for those reasons. But I know like I take medications and I need water to take them. And a lot of other people are the same. And I have sensory processing disorder. So if I go into a restaurant and I need to take my medication, they only have, you know, cold water or something like that. For me to drink it straight out of the cup could trigger my sensory processing disorder. And it would kind of be like an anxiety attack. But basically the point is like there's just so many different ways in which these things are needed that are banned, and it's so impossible to prove, oh, I have a disability, that means I need a straw, because I don't, you know, walk into restaurants or places where, you know, maybe I need just a quick glass of, I mean, I carry a water bottle around everywhere, but like somewhere where I would need water really quickly, which like water is an essential thing for all humans. And I don't just carry around papers that prove, hey, I have sensory processing disorder and this and this and that, and that's why I need your straw. And to expect anyone to have to prove themselves to a random restaurant owner, especially, you know, people with disabilities or with mental or social conditions that could be really scary, or even, you know, because people are ableist, that could be dangerous for them to have to kind of speak about their disability in a place where, you know, if they have a visible disability, it's not visible, but in a place where they could be what's the word, persecuted for that. That's just like a horrible expectation to have to make of individuals when there are so many more effective ways to reduce pollution, because the majority of the pollution in this world is created directly by corporations, not by straws or packaging or anything. So when you imagine how much pollution we have in the water and in everywhere from all this waste that we have from straws and soda cans and everything, it's so much more of that could be prevented through regulation on corporations and industries. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and if somebody wants to take the next question, which is what is the best way to bring up the topic of ableism with someone else as someone who isn't disabled and doesn't want to overstep their boundaries and pretend to know everything? If anybody wants to take that.
Sure, I can take it. Unless anybody else wanted to. Cool. Well, so honestly, what I would say is, as a disabled person myself, I'm never really offended by questions. I think it's always better to ask and get it wrong than it is to assume. So if you mean like you are interacting with maybe friends who are disabled, always just asking, like maybe thinking like, oh, is there ever anything that I could do to like better accommodate you, or things like that, or just opening up the conversation, like saying like, hey, I'm open to talk if you'd ever like to. I'd love to learn more about your experience. That's something that I think I don't really see, and if anyone else wants to comment, I don't really see being offensive or ignorant. And then as far as like within movement spaces, just acknowledging when you do speak on something, like no, I don't have personal experience, but I do I have learned a lot about this, or maybe I've done a lot of research. And obviously like that does kind of separate you from someone who might be disabled themselves, but it still does a lot that you have researched on this thing. And there's nothing to say that just because you aren't disabled, that doesn't mean that you can't try and help create awareness within your organization, but also just ensuring that maybe you do pass the mic to other disabled voices if they do exist in your organization. I hope that answered your question. I don't want to like go off into too many tangents, but if there's anything about that you may want to clarify, I hope that kind of helped.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that just like never speak over people with disabilities. But there's definitely like still speaking up about it because it's not commonly spoke about, and then just trying to identify people who are in that space who you can say this person would know a lot more, or this person would know a lot more, and like I don't want to speak over them. So just like acknowledging your privilege as an able-bodied person is super important.
Yeah. So the next question is for Maddie. Maddie, can you elaborate on the relationship between capitalism and ableism?
Sure. Okay. As we talk like about those things, I just want to make sure we understand kind of what capitalism is. So I don't remember the exact definition we used in the presentation, but one I have saved on my computer is that capitalism is like an economic system based on like private ownership of property and business, with the goal of making the greatest possible profits for the owners. However, the greatest possible profits are typically made only when marginalized groups are exploited, and that directly affects the disabled community because we have much less access to employment and a lot of employment barriers that we don't have access to contribute to capitalism per se. And capitalism functions under something called the ideal body. So when you think about capitalism, like what you need to make capitalism function, you need someone who can do a 40-hour work week. If they are in a more physical, rigorous job, they would need to be non-disabled and be able to lift things, or be more mentally clear, more mentally apt to deal with certain situations, whether that's a change on your day-to-day basis or what have you. And that obviously directly impacts disability, because disability is something that is imposed on top of our impairments by the way we're like unnecessarily isolated and excluded from, the full participation in society. And capitalism only perpetuates that because our disabled bodies, aren't able to contribute to this system of oppression. And I hope that kind of helped. Hope that kind of cleared some things up.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I also included a list of some really great disabled activists that if people are wanting to learn and wanting to get more involved in the community, these are some really, really great folks who do amazing work, either in the government or for social justice organizations, what have you. So if you want to just hear from disabled voices, or just learn more, or just become a little more salient to what's happening in the disability community, I highly recommend you follow these people.
Yeah, definitely utilize that resource. So the next question is, how can people that do not have disabilities help raise awareness for people that do. And I think that the people with firsthand experience should always be at the forefront of a movement, but how can others that aren't disabled help? So the first thing I would say, and definitely somebody wants to kind of elaborate on this answer, please feel free to hop in. But I would definitely say, when it comes to raising awareness, I think the best method to take as a person that's not within the community is to more so raise awareness towards like, be educated basically on what you're saying, and then point the attention back to disabled people. So like, as an ally, just make sure that you're not you're not taking up all the space in that community, that you're not kind of what the quote that Gabrielle was saying, nothing about us without us. You know, it's, make sure you're not centering yourself, and make sure you're educating yourself, because it's not, you know, you're not really helping if you're being an ally that doesn't have, like, that hasn't been working on educating themselves on the issue. So like, definitely making sure you're getting that background information and really going deep with it. And then also making sure you're turning the attention back to the community that you're addressing, and that you're deferring back to them to actually speak on the issues, is really important. And then when it comes to like raising awareness, amplifying their voices, or, you know, our voices. So like on social media, you know, I know a lot of us are there right now because of quarantine. So utilizing that to like follow those accounts that Maddie posted, and follow our socials as well, and just sharing and amplifying resources that are being shared by disabled people about disability is the best way to help raise awareness. And then educating yourself further is, you know, another amazing way to raise awareness. And I think you really can't like do that without, you know, educating yourself. But yeah, let me stop rambling. Does anybody else want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. I think it's so good to like educate yourself on issues, just because there's not always going to be a situation where there is a disabled voice in the room. And so sometimes when things might happen, you know, in your organization, you might be talking about plastic issues, you know? And so if you know about a situation, you can advocate for the disabled community if you know what's going on. And so whenever we can't advocate for ourselves because we're just physically not there and we're not in that space, that's really, really helpful. So as long as there isn't someone that you're speaking over, definitely speak still.
Yeah, and then just utilizing that position of being in those spaces that we aren't in to bring us in. So like changing the game. Like if you're in an organization or in a space that's inaccessible, using that knowledge that you have gained to bring us into that space. That way that it's not just like you recognizing that it is inaccessible, but then, and starting conversations, but not really kind of doing anything else about it. Okay, so Eva asks, how can I continue to learn about ableism so that I can recognize it in myself and places or things in my community and try to help as an able person? Does anybody want to take that?
I can take it. So I definitely think just like the World Institute on Disability has so much information about this, particularly in relation to the climate crisis, but ableism is really everywhere, and you can find it, you can see it everywhere simply with the lack of an elevator or a wheelchair ramp, something like that. And so I just think just continuing to be aware and finding those disabled activists and reaching out and being just aware of yourself and aware of things going on around you. And yeah, I just think that like being aware is just a really big one. And following those disabled activists, you can learn a lot of them about from those people. And yeah, there's so many different organizations and like people out there that will have a lot of amazing information.
Amazing. And the last question we have is, how can I get more involved in disabled communities if I think I might have chronic pain, but have never been diagnosed and cannot be anytime soon? Does anybody want to speak to that?
Whoever
Oh,
was
you
about-
go, you go.
Oh, okay. So yeah, with diagnosis, there are a lot of I guess like just with the whole intersectional thing, there's so many barriers to getting diagnosed. Whether it's, you know, just having the money to go to the doctor or to get tested for whatever it is. But also like doctors are much less likely to diagnose women, to diagnose people of color, and to diagnose people with neurological disorders and like mental illness for physical disabilities and physical illnesses, just because those groups are for some reason less likely to be believed. And I don't remember the exact data on this, but like we learned all about it in my women's health class last semester. But for that reason, not having a diagnosis does not mean that you aren't disabled, and it doesn't mean that you should be excluded from any community. Any disability community that you will find online, as long as they're like a good community, they will not exclude you for not having a diagnosis. And many of the, I mean, I wasn't diagnosed with sensory processing disorder until very recently, but it was something that I kind of claimed many years ago because it's just, I knew I had it and I just didn't have the resources at that time to be diagnosed. And now I am. And even if, you know, you never get a diagnosis for something, you're really the person who identifies, maybe you can't identify a specific medical condition because, you know, you're not a doctor, you're not trained to do that, but you are the person experiencing in the things that are disabling you in your life, whether it's, you know, things around you that would need to be accommodated for you to be able to function properly, or whether it's impairments of your body that, you know, you can't function day to day because of pain. You are the person who recognizes those things in yourself. So for you to identify that way is completely valid in a disability community and advocacy communities. As far as like getting medications, all those things go, like it gets a little more complicated. Of course, you need a doctor for most of those things. But as far as like the community and the advocacy, there's no reason that a good community or a good advocacy group wouldn't accept your voice just because you don't have a diagnosis.
Another quick thing I was going to add to that as well. I know we have another question, but really fast, even just scrolling through the chat, I think a lot of us that were on this call have listed different organizations and our personal handles. If anyone on this call feels like they want to get involved in this space, whether you're disabled or not, and you just want to learn, or you are disabled and you want to kind of grow into that identity. I know for me personally, like a year ago, I didn't officially like on my social media like identify as disabled. I didn't do all this work that I do now, and like now I identify as like a disabled activist. And so there's definitely so I think maybe just sharing that fact might be helpful as well, that like it's definitely possible. And it seems like you know, you might feel like so like outside of the community, like it's something that you can't claim in your head. And there definitely is a little bit of, you know, stuff, you know, like even internal ableism and societal ableism to work through. But once you get through it, you know, it's great. And I guess some ways that you can do that, like I said, are just scrolling through the list and just finding a lot of the way that I did it was just over time, I just connected with more friends and met more disabled friends. Kind of like making that the norm in my social circle, I think helped, just being accepted by people and being like feeling validated. Yeah, so I hope that answered that question. And then the last question is, I'm just curious, do you guys think mental illnesses are disabilities? So I'm going to pass this along to someone else, but really fast, I just want to say that a lot of issues that people with mental illnesses face do intersect within the disability community, things like dealing with stigma and the medical system. But I'm going to pass this on to someone else. So.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say real quick about the hospitals is that every single one of us can definitely talk about years of medical trauma and like people not believing us. And so you do not you do not have to be diagnosed to identify as disabled. I personally didn't identify disabled until I got my official diagnosis, and that was after 3 years of going through different hospitals and different diagnoses and constantly getting stabbed with needles. So like there's no set thing. Like it's really up to you personally.
Yeah, I think those are good really good, helpful responses, and definitely, like everybody's been saying, follow up on this conversation, join communities, do more digging. But yeah, don't feel invalid. And then the last question that Sam was touching on is just, do we think that mental illnesses are disabilities? And so I don't know if anybody wants to add anything else onto that.
If no one else is, I will, but otherwise, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh,
You can pass it around.
I guess what I was just saying, it's really up to the individual to identify themselves as disabled, because even things that many people would consider a disability, like deafness, for example, like many people who are deaf don't consider that a disability. They consider it their language, their culture. It's just the way that they are. And with mental illness, if you have a mental illness and your illness disables you from doing certain things, that impairs your daily functions, or the outside society doesn't accommodate the things that you need simply because of your illness, then yeah, feel free to claim it as a disability for you, because it literally fits the definition. It's disabling these life functions that you're trying to carry out. That being said, the general consensus that I've known is that as far as labeling other people as disabled for having a mental illness, you don't really do that. I know like there are certain and also mental illness is like, because like there's like neurological disorders, there's like emotion, like there's many different types of things that are categorized under mental illness, and some of them are strictly like, yeah, this is a disability, and some of them are like, well, like this is something everyone can experience, it can be temporary, just because mental illness encompasses so much. So I think it's really up to the individual, and if you're not talking about yourself, just call it what it is instead of trying to categorize it as a disability or as anything else. If you're talking about ADHD, call it ADHD. If you're talking about anxiety, call it anxiety, and it's up to the person who has it to consider whether or not it's disabled, it is a disability to them.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, just keeping in mind, like kind of early in the presentation, we were talking about impairment versus disablement, like, and this kind of goes back to what Gabrielle was just saying, like, you can be impaired without being disabled by that impairment. And so like what she was saying about the deaf community, like a lot of deaf people don't consider themselves disabled, and that's okay. And I mean, they like, it's up to like kind of up to the individual to like to do that. And I think obviously society does assign labels to certain things, but like, I mean, if you feel impaired, if you feel like your impairment is kind of leads to your disablement, then I mean, that is a disability. And I know a lot of people will say like they don't consider their impairment a disability, and that's totally valid too. So I think it's just a matter of not invalidating somebody else's condition because you don't personally identify a certain way. And then on the flip side, not trying to box somebody into a certain thing, how Gabrielle was saying, call it what it is. Like if they tell you, like, it's like with language, like if they tell you, like, I identify this way, then you call them that. And if they don't, they don't. And even if you don't recognize that universally, like for them, that's what it is.
Thank you for joining this webinar.
Yeah. You guys asked some really cool questions. And I mean, give us a follow. We'd be happy to continue this conversation off of this, but this has been a full hour of us talking and answering questions. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating. It was so nice to kind of meet all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
The recording and slides are probably going to be up on the
Oh.
Zero Hour website.